we're talking about the kind of the growth of not just the economy of English America, but also the labor force. Not just in terms of obviously just typical settlers who find their way over here, but also you're obviously referring to indentured servants who find themselves in tremendous amounts of debt and then have to pay it off via labor. But also you have, needless to say, a growing number of slaves, all right, being forcibly extracted from Africa to work here in America. Now, let us talk about one of the more important points of the colonial history at this point in time, which is Bacon's Rebellion. And this takes place in what we now call today Virginia. Now, if you all recall, up until this point, the majority of the labor force in Virginia who are working the tobacco plantations are English indentured servants. Right? They make up the majority of the labor force in Virginia. But it's important to note that, remember, in the earliest years of the Virginia colony, indentured servitude, first of all, was legally protected. Indentured servants had rights and privileges. They couldn't be beaten. They couldn't be, tortured. And even then, after about 5 or 7 years, their contract would be fulfilled, and they'd be not only released on their own retirement, they would be able to do whatever they want, but also they were oftentimes given plots of land to work for themselves. Now, with the increase of population in Virginia, this availability of land became incredibly difficult to obtain. And so later on, by let's say the 1670s, you have these indentured servants not receiving any plots of land. And so because they don't have plots of land given to them, and because they don't have money to pay for plots of land, many of these indentured servants just begin basically, I guess what you would call, what's the word I'm looking for, squatting. All right, squatting in empty land that technically didn't belong to the colony of Virginia, rather it belonged to Native Americans. And so it's not uncommon for these ex-indentured servants to come into conflict with the local Native American tribes, who, needless to say, are a little sensitive about people wandering into their territory. Now, in the 1670s, a new governor is appointed, William Berkeley. And William Berkeley, quite frankly, made already a tense situation even worse. The guy was probably, if this had been at any other point in time in early Virginian history, he would have just been another, competent governor. Not really great, but not that bad at it. But because he is incompetent, right, the circumstances that the colony of Virginia find themselves in are very tense, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of tension between the rich and the poor, and between those ex-indentured servants and Native Americans. It just really makes, his decisions make a bad situation worse. Now, William Berkeley, one of the examples of this incompetence is the constant avoidance of conflict with the Native Americans. Right? In other words, whenever a conflict arose, when Native American representatives would complain to him about these ex-indentured servants encroaching the land, he always took the side of the Native Americans. All right, now that in itself is not a problem, but the problem is that to the ex-indentured servants, he is clearly not on their side. All right, so this increases even, it's already a tense situation, so this makes it that much worse. All right, and so, again, tying into this is this issue of what we call stratification. Social stratification, or income disparity, is this gap between the wealthy people of Virginia, or any society, and the poor. All right, now, from the time that the colony was founded in 1607 up until now, 70 years later, this gap has done nothing but increase. There is a clear sign between those who have and those who have not in Virginia. All right, and so this is an example of this. And again, in any society throughout history, all right, from the earliest societies, not just in Europe or in Eurasia, but even here in North America, or in the Americas in general, up until now, a society can only take so much of the stratification, right, before it collapses. Now, in the midst of this, you have a somewhat modestly successful plantation owner by the name of Nathaniel Bacon. Now, Nathaniel Bacon sympathizes with these ex-indentured servants, with these landless zombies for that matter. Right? And so he eventually wins a spot in the Virginia legislature, the colonial assembly, and begins advocating for more and more positions or more and more concessions to these people. We need to do something to help them. Now, you could look at this one way or another. You could say that he genuinely did want to help with these ex-indentured servants, or he just was using them to increase his own political power. One way or another, regardless, Nathaniel Bacon began openly advocating for their position, to the point where he began openly criticizing William Berkeley and his supporters. Right? Got to the point where William Berkeley ordered Nathaniel Bacon's arrest. Nathaniel Bacon was able to escape and eventually raise a rebellion against Berkeley and basically the colony of Virginia. And so this is how the Bacon's rebellion began. All right? And eventually you have Nathaniel Bacon and his rebels and his rebel army eventually burning down many of the Virginia settlements, including Jamestown, all right, during this rebellion. Now, before the rebellion could get any further out of hand, all right, and just as it looked like Nathaniel Bacon had won this rebellion, he dies of an illness about a year later in 1677. All right, and the rebellion pretty much dissipates from there. Now, at the end of the day, what we need to remember more than anything else, and the reason why I'm emphasizing this, is that once the plantation owners got control of Virginia again, they kind of realized that the age of indentured servants is over. Right? There's no more, the indentured servitude process has kind of run its course, and clearly it's become problematic. And so, Virginia, all right, all of a sudden from this point on, begins depending on imported African slaves. All right, all of a sudden, post 1677, the amount of slaves being brought into Virginia skyrockets. All right, why? As indentured servitude is being pushed away, you have them embracing enslaved labor. Now, as all this, so the situation in Virginia is certainly one that is very regional, but it's also becoming more, it's a symptom of something much more problematic, right? How issues back home in England are affecting the colonies, and this is a good example, right? If y'all remember, we were talking about the English Civil War the last time we were discussing in this class. All right, now, if y'all recall, after the English Civil War, a republic in England is established with Oliver Cromwell as its head. All right, and the problem is that it was very not good. All right, not only was Oliver Cromwell incredibly puritanical, remember he banned drinking and smoking and dancing, all right, and just random things. But even then, the British economy began to, the English economy, began to suffer tremendously. And so, it is no coincidence that after Oliver Cromwell's death, the British Parliament, the English Parliament, gets back together and decides pretty much, we need a new king. Right? This whole republic thing's not really working out for us. We do need a monarch. Right? And did I tell you who they got to be the monarch? Charles II, who happens to be Charles' son. So they invite him back and say, hey, we're sorry we beheaded your dad. Do you want to be king? Believe it or not, that's actually how it went down. And, well, I'm making some jokes here, but that's pretty much, Charles II was living in France at the time in exile, and he at first was like, oh, I don't know, but then he kind of realized that, yeah, no, this is my birthright. So after agreeing with a couple of concessions, Charles II becomes King of England. Now, during this time that Charles II becomes king, he begins reorganizing the colonies, right, believing them to be a little too independent for his liking, right? And so, in 1686, the English government creates, or basically dissolves, most of the colonial charters, especially those here in New England, the little colonies, and creates a new colony known as the Dominion of New England. All right. In other words, remember the old charters, remember every colony when it's established basically has an agreement, a charter, all right, saying that the king allows us to live here, and we have our own legislative bodies, we swear loyalty to the king, whatever. He basically ignores all that and creates a new singular colony. So there is no more colony of Connecticut, colony of New York, colony of Massachusetts, or Plymouth. Now there is just the Dominion of New England, this area here in green. All right, now, not only that, all right, he also sends this individual, Edmund Andros, to the Dominion as his new governor. And Edmund Andros is a loyal Englishman, which means not only is he trying to enforce direct English rule, he also is a devout member of the Anglican Church. If y'all recall our old friends, the Anglicans. Right, now remember, keep in mind, the majority of the people who live here are not Anglican. Right, they're Protestant for sure, but they're not Anglican. And so, Amenandros not only begins enforcing Anglican laws. Now, you don't have to convert, all right, but you do have to pay tithes and taxes. All right, so every single person living in the colonies has to pay a tithe, a tax that goes directly to the church, specifically the Church of England. All right, so no matter if you're a Quaker or a Puritan or whatever, you have to pay a tax to the Church of England. Right? And not only that, he also begins suppressing certain freedoms of speech, arresting individuals without cause, etc., etc. And so needless to say, this is a pretty bad situation. Now, Charles eventually dies and is replaced by his nephew, James. Now, James is a okay king, but there's a problem. Is that his intention is to name his brother King of England. The problem with that is that his brother is a devout Catholic. All right, remember, Catholicism in England at this point in time is a huge no-no. So it becomes very evident and apparent that, yeah, this whole monarchy thing, we want it, but this whole James thing is not really working out for us. And so Parliament, once again, begins to scheme. Now, what's different from this scheme than in others is that James has a daughter, Mary, who is Protestant, who is Anglican, but she married the King of Holland. Right here. So, Mary is married to William, right, the King of Holland. And Parliament begins corresponding with her, saying, hey, you know what, your dad is driving us crazy. Do you and your husband want to become monarchs? Now, you might say to yourself, well, why would William want to leave Holland if he's king over it? Well, the thing about it is that the Holland, Netherlands, whatever you want to call it, they have a king, but it's just basically a guy on the throne. Doesn't really do anything. Right? Absolutely no power whatsoever. So William and Mary talk amongst themselves and say, yeah, sure, we'll do it. Right? Now, needless to say, there are concessions. Right? William and Mary have to agree to certain things. So a conspiracy begins, and eventually it is launched. A revolution to overthrow James. Now, this is called the Glorious Revolution because for the most part, it is relatively bloodless. Right? I think there's about 2 or 3 deaths. Now that's, death is death, but compared to the English Civil War where you have thousands dying, this is not all that bad. All right, James is overthrown, he is exiled to France, and the war comes to an end. Funny story, and this is totally FYI. So when James first gets overthrown, he arrives in Ireland hoping to raise an army. All right, he goes to the Catholics in Ireland. Remember, Ireland is predominantly Catholic, and goes, let us, help me take back that throne, and I promise you religious freedom. I promise you your own country, this and that. And so the Irish right away said, yeah, sure, we'll help you fight. But once he raises an army, he says, let me go to France and get support over there, and I'll come back and pick you all up, and we'll go fight. The problem is that James never comes back to Ireland, so he just leaves them hanging. And so from that point on, for the rest of his life in Ireland, James is known as, in the ancient Gaelic language, which Ireland speaks every once in a while still, James the Shit, for just leaving him hanging, which is the greatest nickname in history, I gotta say. He never lived that down. Now, will William and Mary William and Mary on the throne? Remember, Parliament makes him agree to a couple of things. First of all, the more important thing is co-rule. Right, from this point on, right, it makes it very clear. So remember, the whole point of the English Civil War was this debate about home rule, co-ruling. Who gets what authority and who rules over whom, right, between the monarchy and the Parliament. Now it's pretty much established that this is how it's going to be. Right, we rule together. And from this point on, the power of Parliament continues to increase more and more, right, to the point where it is today. Now, you might know or be aware that the Queen of England doesn't really have a lot of authority today. All right, she's just a figure in a throne. That's not necessarily the case. She does still have one very important right as monarch. She rarely uses it. I think she used it maybe once in her 60-odd years of reigning, and that is the power to dissolve Parliament. Now, here that's kind of an unknown because Congress meets and they don't do anything because they're constantly bickering with each other, and you don't have anything done. It's gridlock. Now in Parliament, if things get bad, where they can't do stuff, they can't legislate, they can't pass laws, all right, the Queen, if it's bad enough, will basically say, you know what, this isn't working out, you all go home, and they have new elections. She has the power to dissolve Parliament. You don't have that here in the United States. All right, that's the one power she has, but like I said, she hasn't used it since, I think the last time she used it was in the 60s. But nonetheless, so not only do you have this concept of co-rule, you also have this emphasis on of what we call a Bill of Rights. Individual liberties, right, guaranteed, all right, not by a government in theory, but by natural law, right, whether that's religious or non-religious. We'll talk about that in just a bit. Now, so not only do you have the situation in the Dominion New England. So by the way, I should probably talk about how all of this affects the colonies. All right, the Glorious Revolution is now come and gone. So let us discuss how this actually affects the colonies once they hear about what's going on. So in New York, a German-American merchant by the name of Jacob Leisler seized control of the colony for about the next 3 years and basically runs his own little monarchy. All right, Leisler's rebellion eventually leads into him basically taking over the colony as his own little kingdom until a new governor and a couple of English troops arrive. They arrest him, execute him for treason, and that pretty much marks the end of it. But again, you have this is a clear reaction to what's going on in the Glorious Revolution. With England too busy in this chaos, all right, all of a sudden you begin to see issues developing in the colonies here. Again, in this case, this man, Jacob Leisler, basically trying to overthrow the English government in the colonies, or at least in New York, and declare himself king. Now, another important individual here is this issue of Cold Rebellion, which takes place roughly around the same time in Maryland. Now, if you all recall, Maryland originally was established as a Catholic haven, all right, a safe haven for Catholics in England who were being persecuted for their beliefs. Now, despite this, right, the colony was open to pretty much anyone. Right? One of the earliest actions that Maryland took was basically religious toleration. If you believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, you are welcome in Maryland. Right? That's pretty much the only prerequisite. The problem is that this allowed for more and more Protestants to come into Maryland, and it got to the point where Protestants completely overwhelmed Catholic settlers in Maryland. And in 1689, the Protestants, led by this individual, Cook, specifically John Code, eventually rise up against Lord Baltimore, the still current ruler of Maryland, basically kick him out of Maryland and establish a very anti-Catholic government, pretty much banning Catholics from voting or holding political office whatsoever. All right. So ironically enough, despite this law, these anti-Catholic laws will remain in the books until after independence. Right. So for the next century, despite the fact that Maryland was founded as a Catholic safe haven, all right, you have the Protestants in Maryland overthrowing the Catholic government and establishing a direct anti-Catholic colonial government in Maryland for the next century. All right. So again, Leisler Rebellion, just a simple overthrow of the government for the purpose of this man Jacob Leisler to become monarch. And in Maryland, you have this particular individual or this particular uprising being directly correlated to anti-Catholic sentiment. Now, let us head back to Maryland, because by this point in time, after the Glorious Revolution, the power of the Puritans are declining. All right, more first and second generation Puritans in Massachusetts are not as devoutly religious as their parents were. All right, and it's becoming more and more obvious. Now, really, kind of the beginning and the end for the colonies here is the rise of Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now, if you all recall, Plymouth was founded by the original Pilgrims, the one of infamous stories. But shortly after the founding of Plymouth, another Puritan company, right, founds a colony in Massachusetts. Now, this one, yes, it's supposed to be for religious havens, but more than anything else, it's to make money. Right? And this colony becomes much more prosperous than Plymouth does. Now, after the Glorious Revolution, after things have settled down and the colonies are reestablished, Massachusetts and Plymouth are merged together as one. So in 1692, there is no more Plymouth in Massachusetts. Now there is just Massachusetts. Now, what this means, more than anything else, is the rise of what we call, and this is very important, secular. Does anyone know what this word refers to? When something is secularized or secular? Anyone know? It means apart from religion. And in this case, if y'all recall, in Plymouth, in order to hold public office, in order to engage fully in civic participation, you have to be Puritan, Congregationalist, whatever you want to call it. In Massachusetts, there is really no, for the first few years, yeah, but eventually it becomes pretty much open to anyone with the exception of Muslims, Jews, and Catholics. All right, so as long as you are a Protestant, you can hold public office, and some couple of other requirements. So not only that, but also you begin to see the passing of things such as the Toleration Act, which again allows for more open toleration of other non-Puritan religions. So, combine this with continued anxiety and strained relationship with Native Americans, all of a sudden a declining economy. All of these things combined result in an aura of tension and anxiety. All right, so this is the background which we find ourselves in the village of Salem. All right, Salem, just a few miles north of Plymouth. All right, you have the infamous witch trials. I'm sure all of you have vaguely heard of this, yes? Mm-hmm. All right, you may have seen the movie The Crucible. So here's the thing. First of all, it's important to note that as well known as this event is in American history, this is not unique in the grand scale of Christianity and its war against witchcraft. As a matter of fact, this same year, in 1692, that, all in all, I believe it was 18 people were eventually executed in Salem. Back home in Europe, in general, all right, that same year, about 1,500 people were also executed as well for being witches. Now you may ask yourself, well, how does one define a witch? Whatever. First of all, it's important to note that never in the history of actual historical documentation does it mean that witches have green skin, a wart on the nose, and fly on brooms. Those are not prerequisites, right? Contrary to what TV shows will tell you. Most of the people accused of witchcraft are people who cannot defend themselves. Right? And what I mean by this, specifically speaking, are poor women. Economically poor women are the ones that are oftentimes most targeted. Right? Women who don't have families to take care of them, women who are widows and don't have children, who may have lived on the edge of town. I guess what you would call today, I'm not sure if you all can associate with this, but it seems like in many neighborhoods you have one single lady who has an extraordinary amount of cats, the stereotypical crazy cat lady. Those are the type of women who would be accused of witchcraft. I didn't grow up with a crazy cat lady. I grew up with a crazy pigeon lady. That was even more terrifying, by the way. But nonetheless, right, these economically vulnerable single women oftentimes were at the target of it. And again, you might ask yourself, well, why specifically? Well, again, it doesn't have, so it could be anything from a cow that mysteriously dies for no reason, or at least apparently no reason, crops not coming in, a baby becoming sick, anything like that. All right, all of a sudden, it must be a witch. All right, it has to be involved in this. And it's not just women. Let me rephrase that. Prior to about 1500, prior to the Protestant Reformation, many of the accused witches were actually men. However, after the Protestant Reformation, the majority of them become women. Now, back in Salem, things are a little bit different. The majority of the people being accused of witchcraft do not fit that stereotype. All right. In Europe, yeah, most of the people being accused are again, these single, vulnerable women. But in Salem, the majority of people being accused are actually well-to-do individuals, fairly wealthy, they're wise, etc. But the young girls, there's a group of young girls who begin claiming that witches are visiting them at night and casting spells on them. And during town hall meetings and religious ceremonies, you have many of these girls, breaking down into seizures, convulsing. You have records of them, at one minute they're frozen, the skin is icy cold, and the next minute they're boiling hot. All right, and of course, needless to say, witches are blamed. All right, and they would actively accuse well-to-do members of the community of being witches. All right, and in many instances, they were required to confess. Many of them refused to confess, all right, and eventually were executed nonetheless. Most of them were burned at the stake, with the exception of a few who were hung, and one individual, an elderly man, as a matter of fact, who was accused of witchcraft, who was pressed to death. I don't know, just to give you an image, basically, he's put on a platform, and a large board is put on top of him. And the process of pressing is literally just taking large boulders and putting it on top of this platform until he basically suffocates. All right. It took this one individual days for him to suffocate. All right, days of this. The young girls who were involved in the accusations against these individuals, all right, were for not well-to-do families. All right, some of them were very poor, some of them were okay, but they were not wealthy whatsoever. All right, and so there's a clear distinction, there's a clear indication of this resentment among society regarding those who do have money. All right, and eventually, at the end of the day, it got so out of hand that the governor of Virginia, the governor of Maryland had to step in and say, look, this is getting too far. Once they heard about this individual being pressed to death, they realized that this was getting out of hand. All right, there was many more people being accused and actually held in jail waiting trial, and the governor stepped in and said, enough's enough. Like, this is getting way out of hand. All right, and eventually stories began circulating in Massachusetts and throughout the colonies about just how weird this was. All right, and all of a sudden Congregationalists, Puritans, all of a sudden are now seen as religious zealots, psychos, people who are killing people for no apparent reason. All right, and so this really does break the power of the Puritans in Salem. All right, the Congregational Church will continue to exist beyond this point, but it never will have the power that it had, in the 1630s, 1640s. All right, now it is, from this point on, they're pretty much a non-factor in the politics of this region, all right, for the rest of, the rest of history, quite frankly. Any questions regarding witches, Salem, whatever? Now, every once in a while, I will have a student who will ask me, are witches a thing? And I have a very hard time answering this because technically I suppose yes, but not in the sense that most people think. In other words, are there people who claim to be witches who exist? Yes. Right? Are people engaging in witchcraft? Yes, but the problem is that the definition of witchcraft it varies from person to person. Because technically witchcraft is anyone who engages in a type of deception or a type of, I guess what you would call magic. So if you're one of those people who can make a quarter appear out of behind someone's ear, you're technically engaging in witchcraft. If you're reading, if you get your tarot cards read or your hand, your palms read, you're technically engaging in witchcraft. So does witchcraft exist? Yes. Is it witchcraft where they can turn children into cats and they feed on young babies? As far as I know, no. So that's all I'm going to say. All right. So if you have any questions on witchcraft, I'm not the person to ask. I'm sorry. All right, my knowledge of witchcraft is limited to basically history. All right. Now, again, as I mentioned before, by the late 1600s, the colonies are growing and becoming incredibly diverse. Right, and I want to talk a little bit about the growing diversity of population. All right, because by 1770, so it's amazing to think that in 1607, all right, when Jamestown was founded, it is 100 people arrived here, all right, from England. Fast forward to 1776, the eve of the Revolution. All right, that population increases to 3 million people. All right, so that is a significant explosion of population here in the period of, 170 years. All right, now, early on, the colonies did struggle-ish to find settlers, all right, and to have the English government becoming more and more creative in terms of sending his people. All right, in many instances, jails back home in England were empty, and these prisoners were basically put on ships and sent to the New World. And so convicts became an early source of migrants into Virginia and into other colonies, particularly Carolina. Now, another source of migrants, forced migrants, came in the form of the Scots-Irish. Now, the Scots-Irish are fascinating because they are such a unique story. Now, if y'all recall, the Irish have been giving the English problems for the last 1,000 years. Right? The Irish just refuse to submit to English rule. They refuse to not become or stop being Catholic. They're just constant problems and constant issues. Now, in the 1500s and the early 1600s, a new policy was adopted. If we can't kill them, if we can't conquer them, let's breed them out. All right, so the English began inviting wealthy Scot noblemen, right, to go to Ireland, gave them land, and told them, take Irish wives, settle here, move your children. Right? The Scots, by this point in time, remember, the Scots are become docile, they become tame, they become loyal subjects of the crown. And so the hope is, by moving as many Scots as possible to Ireland, you will basically do the same thing there. Right? You'll breed out the rebelliousness and the Catholicism and all that stuff. So, after a few generations, lo and behold, what happens? Nothing. The Irish are still as rebellious as they were, and now you have a group of people of both Scottish and Irish descent who are just as problematic. And so, in order to reduce the problems, the English began forcing the Scots-Irish onto ships and pushing them here. Now, the Scots-Irish do not have the funds or the money or the resources to buy land on their own. And so many of them, upon arriving in the New World, will begin pushing into the undesirable regions of these regions here. As you can see here, these areas in blue are the areas where you predominantly find Scots-Irish populations. But it is important to note, you really can't see in this map, that these areas are high mountains that really can't grow anything. Right? They can't grow cash crops like you can in the plains of Virginia or in Carolina. And so they take the most undesirable land that is basically there because no one else wants it. Right? And so it is here that the Scots-Irish, right, will make their home even to this day. The descendants of these areas, right, in many cases, their families have never left since the 1600s. Okay? Now, probably aside from the English, the largest and most numerous of these early migrant waves is that of the Germans. Religious wars, civil wars, economic anxiety, all compelled many German migrants to move to the colonies during this period of time. Right? And so, very quickly, they quickly become the largest non-English ethnicity in the colonies at this point in time. Now, unlike the Scots-Irish, all right, most of the Germans come with their families and they do have funds to basically spend to buy land. As you can see here, many of these German migration homes are here in these relatively fertile areas of the Carolinas, upper regions of New York, and here in southern Pennsylvania and northern Maryland. Are relatively prosperous, fertile regions where these German families begin migrating and starting lives of their own. Now, despite the fact they had a large population of diversity, of religious diversity, at least in Christian terms, Catholics, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Lutherans, etc., this is not what we call a melting pot. Now, oftentimes you might hear this phrase that the United States is a melting pot, and what it refers to is, like, I'll give you an example. Up until a few years ago, I not only taught here, but I taught at NSU. Right? And NSU has the student union over there, and they have this kind of cafeteria. All right, or not cafeteria, but they have this food court where you can get various things. You can get Chick-fil-A, you can get a burger, and so on. My favorite thing to do was to go there, and I love the waffle fries from Chick-fil-A. Right? But right next to it is this really good sushi place. So I would get a sushi roll and waffle fries, and that would be my lunch. Now, you may see that's weird, but this is an example of the melting pot here, where you have this blending of this mixture of things. Like even, the other day, me and my wife went down to this new restaurant where they have this fusion of Mexican and Asian food, and it was really, really good. So this is the kind of melting pot where you have just this blending of peoples, where one street here, just specifically here in El Paso, there's one block where you have a Presbyterian church, and down the way there is a mosque or synagogue. All right, this is what I'm referring to. Now, this, right, colonial society in the late 1600s, early 1700s is not a melting pot. All right, it is, for the most part, very segregated. All right, for example, this region here that I was pointing out where it's predominantly German, you'll have mostly German communities who don't speak English, who practice Lutheranism, and keep to themselves. All right, and they're very segregated from the other English, Anglican, communities just down the street from themselves. So it's not this melting pot that the United States will become familiar with or will become later on. It is still very segregated, and even then, there are limits to religious liberty. Right? Many colonies here have laws limiting public involvement, right, to Protestants, specific Protestants. Right? Again, as I mentioned before, the small number of Catholics, Jews, atheists, and even some Muslims who find themselves in the colonies at this point and find their right to practice their religion incredibly limited at this point. Now, needless to say, one of the things that I'm forgetting, or at least not forgetting, but not mentioned at this point in time, is how this increase in population affects Native Americans. Needless to say, it causes severe detriments. All of a sudden, the traditional Native American populations that found themselves in this eastern part of what becomes the United States are being constantly pushed further and further westward, if they're not killed immediately. All right, and so all of a sudden they find themselves in tradition, and they find themselves with a choice: do we resist? Do we just, submit ourselves to English rule? What do we do? And in many cases, they made the best of a really, really, really bad situation. Oftentimes, willing to sell their land to settlers, all right, and take that money to transfer further west beyond the mountains here. This region here is the Appalachians. It will mark the boundary, at least early on, of basically what becomes an Anglo land and Native American land. Now, not everyone in the colonies, as I mentioned before, was wealthy. There are plenty of those who are impoverished and poor. However, it's important to note that if you had to make a choice between being poor in the colonies or being poor back in England, in terms of health, in terms of overall quality of life, it is better to be impoverished in the colonies here than it is over there. Right? Here, there is a constant demand for labor. Here, there's a possibility of improving one's life. Your caloric intake, right, the daily amount of calories that you take in, right, is higher here than it is over there. So there is a higher standard of living in the colonies here than the average person back home in England. All right, so again, it's not to say that everything was hunky-dory and everyone was fine. No, it was not. However, on average, all right, the level of poverty was much higher in England than it was in the colonies itself. Cities are still very, very small at this point in time. The largest of these early colonial cities is the city of Philadelphia, which only has about 12,000 people in it. Compare that to the Spanish colonial capital of Mexico City, which at the time has roughly about 500,000 people living in it. So it's still, these towns are growing. Boston, Philadelphia, New York City, all are growing exponentially. However, they're still relatively small in terms of just population. Nonetheless, as citizens of the British Empire, all right, the colonies have access to more and more items that used to be considered luxury items. For example, by this point in time, tea all of a sudden has become a standard necessity in the diet of most, not just back home in England, but even the colonists. All right, so black tea, all right, which at one point in time was a very, very luxury item, very rare, all of a sudden becomes a standard part of the diet, as is sugar, as is other of these diets. And this is one of the advantages that the average British citizen had, or English citizen had, all right, compared to everyone else. They had this increasing access to all these what used to be considered luxury items, and soon become just typical day-to-day items that you would find in any cupboard for the most part. Now, the Native Society, all right, are basically two main occupancies. Right? In other words, the wealthiest of the colonial society, right, in general, are the planters of the South, particularly those of tobacco and rice, and that of the merchants, specifically located around the city of Boston. Right? These individuals, all right, become kind of the elite of society, all right, and kind of at the very pinnacle of this kind of wide gap between the rich and the poor here. All right, now these individuals themselves, again, many of them live here, but at the same time, they often send their children to England to study and to live for a time. They experience the finer things in life, just like a typical wealthy individual tends to do. Now, many of the New World cultures that we find here, in terms of singing and dancing and literature and art, et cetera, there is no, at this point in time, unique American culture. Not yet. Right? In other words, there's nothing here distinctly American. It's just basically just copying things back home in Europe and just bringing them over here. Right? So when we're talking about what people read or what people sing or the music that they conduct or the art that they appreciate, there really is no such thing as a uniquely American one. All right? It won't be for a while. All right? Most of this culture that we find is actually just basically, imported or ripped off, so to speak, from England. Now, starting in the 1650s, 1660s, the population of the Caribbean, right, particularly that of the the English Bahamas, begins to explode, and eventually you have plantation owners in Bahamas looking for other areas to expand in. And that's where you begin to see them arriving in South Carolina to establish plantations of rice and indigo. All right, now these wealthy plantation owners, again, part of this elite that I'm talking about, these grandees. Now, the word grandee basically refers to large landowners, right? And South Carolina is specifically full of them. And so, again, these grandees enjoy, again, a significant amount of wealth and prosperity. Now, the poor of society make do by becoming one of two occupations. Either wage laborers, individuals who work for these individuals, like for example, in the major urban areas of New York, Philadelphia, Boston, you're always looking for people who can help, right? Individuals who will work and for wages, right? They'll be paid a specific wage, a day, and at any point in time, that job could dry up and no longer exist. Then you move on to the next job. But then you also have sharecropping. Does anyone know what sharecropping is? Anyone heard of this before? Kind of. So think of it this way. In many instances, these large landowners don't directly plant things on their own. In other words, they don't really spend the money to tend to the fields and either hire workers or bring in African slaves. Instead, what they'll do is they'll take their land, divide it up, and then all of a sudden rent it out. So in this case, what's your name again, sir? Edgar. Yeah. Edgar here is a sharecropper. He doesn't have any land of his own, but knows how to farm. So he comes to me, the plantation, or the landowner, not a plantation, the landowner, and I will agree to not only let you rent out land, but also, since he doesn't have, remember, farming is not just one of those things where you just kind of okay, well, I'm going to farm now. No, it's a lot of investment, because you have to find seeds, you have to find things to fertilize the soil, you have to find equipment, things like that. He doesn't have the money for it, so I will back him on that. All right, I will give him equipment. I will rent out whatever. Now, this is the problem, though, is that the agreement is that whatever it is on your platform, all right, you will give me half of your harvest. All right, the problem is that it takes a lot, but again, remember, not only are you trying to feed yourself, but you're also trying to pay off the debt that you owe to me. Because all the equipment that you bought from me, all the seeds, et cetera, you have to pay all that back. So you make enough to barely survive, barely feed yourself and your family, all right, but everything else belongs to me. And the idea is that, okay, once you pay back your debt, then you're on your own. You're free to do whatever you want. The problem is that never happens. Because why? Because that debt keeps piling up. Because remember, let's say, for example, a piece of equipment that I gave him breaks. All of a sudden, you need another piece of equipment, so who are you going to get it from? From me. So all of a sudden, that debt continues to increase. It's almost a form of slavery in that sense, where you never get out of that debt ever. All right, but this is the reality that many other sharecroppers have. All right, this idea that yes, you work the land that you own, but you're not really owning it. And even then, you're in debt to the guy who actually does own it. So that makes sense what sharecropping is? Yes? Mm-hmm. All right, this will become a common theme, all right, for much of American history. All right, this idea of this semi-slavery in the form of sharecropping. And again, not everyone is either insanely rich or insanely poor. You have those who get by, people who have a particular skill. This is this word that I refer to, and it's important that you all know it because it does mean something. Does anyone know what this phrase refers to? An artisan? Anyone? It's someone who has a particular skill. In this case, if you know how to manipulate iron, and you can make horseshoes, or you're a good carpenter, a skill, you're considered to be an artisan. All right, and these artisans can make pretty good money. All right. Likewise, if you are lucky to own enough land, so not to say that you own these huge fields or these acres upon acres. Let's say that you own enough to feed your family and to maybe sell some stuff on the market. All right, you are considered to be technically a yeoman. Y-E-O-M-A-N. A yeoman is a small farmer who, again, has enough land to feed his family and, again, maybe on a good year have enough produce or have enough pigs or sheep or cattle to sell in the market. All right, and so this makes up the majority of what I guess you would call today the middle class. All right, these individuals who don't have to who don't have to defer to wage laborers or sharecroppers, right? These people who kind of manage their own. Now, women in society, remember, as we talked about, English women, in terms of comparison to, let's say, for example, the French or some others, are incredibly oppressed. Political legal rights are, as young girls, belong to your father, and upon your marriage, transfer over to your husband. Nonetheless, all right, as colonial society advances and evolves, you begin to see more and more women get involved themselves in the workplace. All of a sudden, manage general goods stores, or if their husband dies, then there's no one else to take care of there's no male heir. Many colonies begin allowing for women to basically assume and inherit this property. And so you do begin to see women actively helping out with the family's finances, all right, which of course really is directly related to the standard of living. Now, what I'm going to do real fast, and again, I'm not going to go the entire way, is I am going to cover the first few slides of this next chapter, and then I'll let you all go. Now,
really quick, you said for sharecropping, it was like, it's like a never-ending debt, right?
yeah, in reality.
Wouldn't you say that's like owning property still?
I'm sorry?
Wouldn't you say that's like owning property still?
Yeah.
Because you're still paying taxes on it till day's end?
So, remember, keep in mind that the kind of the hook in sharecropping is not necessarily that, you know, you're renting out property, like that's your property, whatever, but again, most of the people who sign these sharecropping contracts don't have the means to start up a farm. And so what really is the big debt collector, what really is the big liability in this case, is the equipment and the startup. So the cost of the seeds, the cost of the equipment, the cost of whatever, and even in many instances, they don't have enough money, they don't have enough food to cover themselves for the first year, and so the sharecropper will pay for that. And so and the sharecropper doesn't mind because again, that's all added to that tab at the end of the year, all right? And so, as you know, and again, things happen. Crops might not come in like you had hoped. A storm could freeze all your crops. A piece of equipment could break. So all of these things have to be taken into consideration. And, you know, this is far from just being a landlord-tenant situation. Does that make sense? This isn't. We're not talking about renting up. Imagine, like right now, if you live in an apartment and something breaks, right? It is the responsibility of the landowner to fix that. You know, basically, and one would hope that you find yourself at least where you're not being charged for that piece of equipment, right? Because it's already technically included in your rent. But imagine a situation where you know, something in your apartment out of your control breaks, your air conditioning unit, something like that, and all of a sudden the landlord says, well, I can fix it, but I'm going to have to charge it to this month's rent. All right, that is pretty much what's happening with sharecroppers at this point in time. Any other questions? Okay. So very quickly, I want to discuss a little bit more detail since it's becoming more and more, again, as I mentioned before, after Bacon's Rebellion, the amount of slaves in the British colonies find themselves. I'm sorry, I think I mentioned this last time, but just to reiterate, you'll see me interchange these again, and I'm trying my best because right now, so Britain refers to the Kingdom of Great Britain. So in about a few decades after this, England, Scotland, and Ireland will form one single united kingdom, or the Kingdom of Britain, right? And so this is why I refer to the British. Right now, that hasn't happened. At the timeline that we're in right now, England is still England. All right, so I'm sorry if I keep mixing up one and the other. Now, so as I mentioned, in the English colonies, you know, the number of slaves post 1680 will begin increasing dramatically, especially in the southern regions of the colonies. And so I want to get into just exactly what that looks like or how that works. Now, the English economy, as I mentioned before, is heavily relying on mercantilism. Remember this idea that the colonies only exist to provide raw materials and a market base for manufactured products made back home in England. And so what you begin to see happening is these various triangular trades that occur in the New World. And there are various examples of them. There's not just one triangular trade. As you can see here, there's a bunch of triangles on the map here. The one that I really want to refer to, and the one that becomes probably the most important one, at least in regard to the colonies, is the triangular trade that occurs, well, let me explain. So, let's start in point 1, which is here in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, all right, there is something growing, which we discussed already, which is a high value. And that is what?
Sugar.
The tobacco is being grown, but it's more than the name of the game is what?
Sugar.
Sugar cane, right? Now, sounds like a dumb question, but I'm being very honest, and I'm trying to. I have a point to this. Why is sugar valuable? It's addicting. Let's be honest, right? But there is I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's a byproduct, right? With sugar, once you draw out the syrup from the sugar cane, you can make a lot of stuff in it. And there's one particular product, a byproduct of sugar, which is incredibly valuable. It's manufactured actually in Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island. What is it? Rum. Rum is the byproduct of it is that distilled syrup from sugarcane can be turned into rum. Now, another dumb question. Why is rum important? I'll give you a clue. It's not for the obvious reason. It's not for, as we colloquially say here in El Paso, para pistear. Right? Certainly, that's a big reason for it, but it's not the only reason. Anyone know?
Was it?
Does anyone know what grog is? No? Grog. G-R-O-G. So, here's why rum is important, aside from the obvious reason, right? It's not for, I'm trying to think of it's not for rum and cokes, let's put it for that way. The reason why this is important is that, so the average trip between point A and point B, depending on weather, is between 2 or 3 months. Worst case scenario, it could take you 6 months to get from point A to point B. But usually, depending on the weather, it can take you about 2 months at the fastest. Nonetheless, remember, plastic water bottles or even metal containers are not really a thing. And so water in these ships is stored in wooden casks. Casks that are cured and they're built to hold water as much as possible. Now, for the first month, you can drink water out of a cask pretty safely. All right. After that, it gets a little slimy. All right. After that, the water actually starts turning into sludge. All right. It's all the algae and all the bacteria growing in there, and so by about month 3, without anything, it basically just it's gross. All right. It won't kill you. It's not going to be fun though. And so, rum is actually used to mix in with the water. Right? It's used to, it's very small amounts of rum, but nonetheless, in a small amount of rum, unbeknownst to them, they just discovered it as, hey, like the rum, makes the water tolerable. But what they didn't know at the time is that the alcohol in the rum is actually killing many, not all, but a lot of the bacteria in the water. Right, making it safer to drink. And so this is why. The mixture of rum and water is known as grog. All right, and so rum is allowing for these long voyages to carry water without basically poisoning themselves. All right, so this is why rum is so important in this early British colonial economy, is because of its, I guess, unbeknownst to them, medicinal uses. So, here's the thing. So again, in the Caribbean, all right, slaves in these English-held colonies, and among others, remember, keep in mind that, technically speaking, English merchants are only supposed to be trading with English plantation owners, but that's never the case. All right, you have the French and the Spanish here both, making sugar, and French sugar at this point in time is actually less expensive than being grown in England. So it's not uncommon for English merchants to basically smuggle in French sugar. So here's the thing. The sugar, once the syrup is drawn from the cane, it is then boiled. All right, it is boiled and eventually turned into something known as, anyone know? Molasses. All right, molasses. The molasses is the product that you're looking for at the end of the day. This is what is the most important thing about this. You can dry it further and it turns into brown sugar, which then you can turn into granulated whatever. but it's molasses that's important here. So this molasses is shipped from the Caribbean up to Newport, Rhode Island, which is the rum capital of the world. I laugh because you think, oh, it's in Havana or in Puerto Rico or in the Dominican Republic. No, it's in Newport, Rhode Island. It is there that you have these huge distilleries that produce rum. Now, this rum is taken, among other products, to Africa. And there, it is traded for more slaves. All right, these slaves are then taken back to the Caribbean, all right, where they are sold in exchange for molasses. Does that make sense how this works? So again, just to reiterate, molasses is produced in the Caribbean, and it is taken to Newport, Rhode Island, where it is turned into what? What's the product that we're looking for? Rum. And there, the rum is loaded on ships and sent to Africa, where there it is exchanged for, among other things, slaves. The slaves are then brought back to the Caribbean, where they are forced into service, and again, exchanged for more molasses. Now again, that's just one example of a triangular trade. There are others here that are just as important, but this is the one that I want you to remember more than anything else. Now, between 1500 and 1800, so in 300 years, it is estimated that 16 million West Africans will be captured and enslaved and sent across the Atlantic. 16 million. This is obviously, needless to say, a tremendous amount of numbers, and it also has an effect on the populations there in society. Now, how this works, now keep in mind, the Europeans looking for slaves rarely go into Africa to hunt for potential slaves. Instead, they have contracts with local friendly political entities, tribes, kingdoms, etc., who do the hunting for them. So an example here, there is a kingdom here in this angle of Africa known as the Kingdom of Benin. FY, you don't have to remember it. Benin has an understanding with the European powers, particularly the English and the Portuguese. They will go out of their frontier, go out of their borders, and look for villages, tribes, etc., capture as many as they can, bring them back to Benin, and there they will sell them as slaves. All right, so most of the actual slave hunting is actually done by Africans. Now, so Benin is just one example. There are several other kingdoms who have this kind of collaboration with these European merchants, all right, and makes them incredibly wealthy. But there are some instances where you have basically a betrayal. An example, FY, Kingdom of Congo. Further south here, in Western Africa, they originally had the same contract with the Portuguese. They will capture as many slaves as they can from nearby other peoples and sell them to the Portuguese. But the Portuguese, their demand for slaves was so much that they actually began capturing and enslaving those headhunters, those who were actually looking for slaves. So they would put everyone on board the ships. And eventually this results in a war, which eventually results in the Portuguese conquering the Kingdom of Congo and having a perpetual slave market there. So again, while it can be financially beneficial to these political entities to cooperate with the Europeans, it is not uncommon for Europeans to stab their so-called business partners in the back and sell them into slavery. Now, of the 16 million slaves taken between 1500 and 1800, 10 million will make it across. The majority of them will head to Brazil. I think I have a map here. The majority of them will head to Brazil, but the others you'll begin to see kind of perpetuate throughout Spanish America and even into the British colonies, English colonies, sorry. Now, you might say to yourself, well, what happened to the other 6 million? The other 6 million are dead. Right? These slave ships that take these slaves across the Atlantic are not meant to be comfortable. Right? The Europeans began realizing that regardless of how their goal is to bring back as many slaves as possible alive. Are realizing that many will not make it. They're not really interested in those who die anyway. As far as they're concerned, the way they see it, they're separating those really strong slaves from the weak ones who aren't going to do anything anyway. And so these slave ships, I think I have a picture of slave. No, I don't. I'm sorry. Let me pull one up here. So these slave ships, again, are not meant for comfort. They're meant for maximizing the amount of slaves that can be carried at a single time. And they're not really fed. They barely have enough water. And they're just really, literally chained next to each other, right? And as close as possible, like sardines, right? Inevitably, it's going to happen that one of these individuals will die, right? And upon that happening, that individual will be unlocked from his chains because they're chained to the ground, right? They'll be unlocked and just basically thrown overboard. So 6 million in those 300 years will perish, right, during this period of time, right? It is, needless to say, a horrific example of the history of this particular slave trade. So you can see here, right, this is exactly what I'm referring to. They're tightly packed as much as possible, chained to the ground, facing upward, right? And they will remain there until they arrive at their destination, unless they die, which they are thereby removed and just simply thrown overboard. Any questions regarding this? Now, as I mentioned before, slaves who find themselves working sugarcane plantations in these tropical regions of Brazil and in the Caribbean are the ones who are going to suffer the most. The average lifespan of a slave working a sugarcane plantation is 3 years. I needless to say, it is a horrible, traumatic experience. Now, in the actual English colonies, the mainland English colonies, which become the 13 colonies later on that we're familiar with, right, the fate of slaves varies depending on the region that they find themselves in. All right, those who arrive at the Chesapeake, in other words, the area of Virginia, Maryland, will find themselves usually laboring in the tobacco fields. All right, it is strenuous, hard labor. However, all right, it is nowhere near as horrible as it is in sugarcane plantations. All right, not trying to diminish it, but just again compare one to the other, and it's a very vague comparison. The Carolinas and Georgia, again, they become the humidity and the climate of the region allows for the creation of indigo and rice fields. Right, the slaves who work there not only work in more dangerous conditions, but they also there is a more stringent, harsher slave society founded there. All right, one that really, again, limits your the slave's ability to even interact with a fellow slave, much less engage in any type of resistance or rebellion. Now, in the middle colonies in New England, you have a number of slaves. However, many of them are I guess what you would call domestic servants. Usually work indoors, work in the house. Still, a slave society nonetheless, but nowhere near as oppressive as you will see in the Carolinas or the colony of Georgia. Now, in the tobacco fields of Virginia, you have a social hierarchy that quickly formed. Remember this from the wealthiest to the slaves, right? You have this kind of social class. Obviously, this is to say the plantation owners at the very top. The tobacco plantation owners themselves dominate every aspect of society: politics, religion, etc., etc. Right? They are the ones who run the show. Next are the yeomen. Remember, yeoman is a what? What is it?
Artisan?
No,
Oh, no.
A yeoman is a small farmer. Basically enough land to feed himself, and that's it. Right? They're kind of in the middle of this. Right? So they're modest, successful farmers. They don't own plantations. Yes, some of them may own slaves, but usually, again, remember, the process of owning slaves is one that is incredibly expensive. Right? Most people at this point in time in the colonies do not own slaves. Some yeomen may own a slave, but rarely is it for the purpose of working fields. Maybe for domestic servants or et cetera, but again, they usually just have enough funds or money to feed themselves and their families, and that's about it. Next are the tenant farmers, the sharecroppers. Right, again, at the lower rungs of society, this also includes wage laborers as well. Those individuals who may come to work as vacations, they work alongside slaves, or others may come to do other labor, like build housing or build barnyards, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, finally, you have an issue of slaves. All right. I think I have lecture note today. On Tuesday, next Tuesday, we'll finish up with chapter 4, and we'll go over the parameters of your all's exam that we'll do next weekend. Before I leave, make sure to take attendance, and I'll send you on your way.